Rabban, tonight is July 28th. We're in the laws of Bishul Akum, Tzurba Rabban on volume 5, page 76. We're on cases where Bishul Akum is permitted. What allows us to eat the food if it's prepared by a Gentile? What are the things that can be done that allow it to be eaten? So even if the food that we wish to have a Gentile cook for us is subject to Bishul Akum, right? It's a kind of food. We've already described multiple foods that don't qualify. Anything that can be eaten raw is one example. Anything that is not oila al shulchan melachim would not qualify for Bishul Akum. But let's say we're dealing with things that do qualify. There are still a number of other potential cases where it might not apply. So according to Gemara and Avodah Zarah, if the Jew placed meat on fire, if the Jew put the meat on the fire, then even if the Gentile turned on the fire, there's no problem with Bishul Akum, since the Jew participated in the cooking process. And the Gemara Masech Avodah Zarah Daf Lamed Ches, Amar Rabbi Shmuel, Inech Yisrael Baso Gabi Gecholim. If the Jew placed the meat on top of the coals, Uba Goy v'Hofach, and a Gentile comes and turns the steaks, mutter, because the Jew participated in some way, in some fashion. It Marnami Amar Rav Yochanan, Bein Sheniach Goy v'Hofach Yisrael. If the Gentile placed the meat on the coals and the Jew came around and turned the steaks, Bein Sheniach Yisrael v'Hofach Goy. Or if the Jew placed the meat on the grill and the Gentile turned them, mutter. Eino osur ad shetet filoso ugmaro biyad goy. The Gemara says that the beginning and the end, l'chor, it seems to suggest that the Gentile has to be involved from the beginning to end of the cooking process. So according to Gemara, Bishul Akum does not take effect unless the Gentile performed the entire cooking process. But if the Jew performed either the placement of the food or turning it over, the food is permitted. This is how the Rambam learns in Macholas Asuros. The Kol Shebishlo Yisrael Ma'at Bishulo, as long as the Jew did some of the cooking, Bein B'tchila Bein B'sof, doesn't make a difference in the beginning or at the end, mutter. Lefichach, therefore, Miniach Hagoy Basar, if a Gentile placed meat, O Kedera Gabi or a dish cooking food on top of fire, the Jew turned the meat over, or he put a spoon into the dish and stirred it, or vice versa. The Jew originally placed the meat or the dish on the fire, and the Gentile came to stir it. In either case, hareza mutter. So if a Gentile is cooking food and you come along and stir the food, at some point during the cooking process, it removes the problem of Bishul Akum. And that certainly is what a lot of our wives do when their housekeepers are, we'll see in a minute, it's not that pashut that our housekeepers would even be considered a problem of Bishul Akum. We're going to learn that tonight. But let's say, according to the opinions that say that they are a problem, so one method is that the wives come and they stir at some point during the cooking process. Now, what about turning on the fire? So it's not so pashut. One of the most important practical questions concerning Bishul Akum involves whether the Jew may simply turn on the fire used for the cooking. According to the Beis Yosef, although the Gemara in Rambam stated clearly that the Jew need not perform the entire cooking process, it's not sufficient for him to ignite the oven or stoke the coals. Because you notice we talked about hafach ba, that means turning it or stirring it. Neither the Rambam nor the Gemara talked about just lighting the fire. So he must participate, says the Beis Yosef, in the actual cooking process. And turning on the fire is not going to be enough. Harav Rabbeinu Nisim, Kosav Gabi Pas, regarding baking bread, Sholosh Malachos Yeshba, there are three types of malacha that go into this. The ish shagar Yisrael v'afa goy, if the Jew just turned on the fire and the goy baked the bread, shori. However, says the Rabbeinu Nissen, shori means permitted, but the dafka b'pas, but that leniency is only by bread. Lefi sheshkira sataner hi malacha miyuchedes bo. There, we'll see in a minute why bread is treated differently than cooking other foods. And starting the fire is a special malacha. And therefore, as long as the Jew does that, that's enough to make it pas Yisra, not pas akul. Even though the non-Jew baked it, made the dough, baked the whole thing, as long as the Jew turns on the oven, it's considered pas Yisrael. But regarding food, low, turning on the fire is not enough. This is the base Yosef. Now, remember Rav Yosef Karo. We're going to see this in all of the sugyas. The Amrinan shoifeses isha kedera, that the woman has to place the pot on the stove. That's not just turning on the fire. The Amrinan hiniach Yisrael basra gabi gecholi. Or we talked about the Jew actually placing the meat on top of the coals. Umashma, from these two statements, just turning on the fire is not enough. Which for us is a very important posek. Rishon lived in Barcelona, and we follow most of what the Rashba in Shilas and Shuvas of the Rashba, etc. He's a big machriya for us. In his Sefer Bayis Shlishi, he said the same thing. Another Rishon. Because of what Rav Rabbeinu Yonah, lo yiter anochi amachmas otoch ha'esh, afilu hishlich Yisrael eitz echad b'tanu. The non-Jew should not place the pan into the fire, even though the Jew had thrown one of the pieces of wood into the fire. She'ena taner nichshar b'shlachos ha'eitz. This act where it becomes a Jew involved just by kindling the light is only el la'afus hapas bilvad. That leniency, as we said above, is only for baking bread. Avalo tafshil el tzarich sheyitena Yehudi et hamachmas atoch hatanur. The Jew has to place the pan into the oven. L'makam aroy litbashel sham, in the right place. Umashma delfi divrayim kol shechein dechiyus sibor lamani. This Rabbeinu Yonah is more machmir than what was said before. That all you have to do is stir it, or right, but you don't. Or here they're requiring you to be meiniach it into the oven, and therefore chitui alone, that means lighting the fire, is not enough. L'chein kosav harav Rab Yitzchak bar Sheshes the Shuta Rivash v'zel shono kvar yiskimu kol hamafarshim she'en shkiras hataner mo'el lebapas. Lighting the oven only works for bread. Aval b'sharmish bashlim, other foods, ein shkiras hataner v'lo adlakas ha'esh mala umoredes. It's not enough. El anocha dafka. You gotta place the dish on the oven. Ad kan l'shon. Okay. However, for Ashkenazim, we're going to have a leniency. The Darchei Moshe, who is the Ramah, it's a different sefer that Rav Moshe Isherlis wrote, brings Rishonim that conclude based on the Gemara that a Jew lighting or stoking the fire is effective in preventing the food from being forbidden due to Bishul Akum. Says the Darchei Moshe, Nirali, the Sfir Ludul Cholhani Ravusa, the Chitui Nami Osir Kamad Loka, that if a non-Jew just did kindling, that would be Osir. Mashemir Gemor Dim Hifich B'Bosar Oigi Shari, and Erotzalomer Hipich B'Gecholim, he's not referring to turning the coals, the Hainu Chitui, El Koyabosir is referring to flipping the meat, much because of a Rabbah. Shem hipich v'basar ohigis b'kedei rishari. That as long as the Jew turned the meat or stirred the pot, that would be enough activity by the Jew to take it out of the parts of Bishul Akum. Onam midivrei aroy shekasati lel shekasav doagin lahater bishulei hashchachos goyos. We permit, because in Krakow there were already non-Jewish maids working in Jewish homes, and the Darchei Moshe says that we have a minhag to be matir that which the maids cook. Mishum di'yevsha shelo yechta echad, because certainly at least one Jew had stoked the fire once. Mashma de poshet lahato chitui. Comes out that as long as the Jew does stoking the fire, that's enough. B'chein poshet ba'aruch, the Isra v'heter ha'aruch Rav Yoina ben Yisrael Ashkenaz. Lahato chitui v'ashlachas kisim, throwing wood into the fire or stoking the fire. So the Darchei Moshe cites the Marami Rottenberg, the Meor HaGola, who lived in Worms, that lighting one's fire from another fire is sufficient. Right? Because of Mishem Maram, Dimidlika Goya Eish Me'eshel Yisrael. If the non-Jew took the fire from a fire that was held by a Jew, and then the non-Jew used that fire that she got from the non-Jew, let's say, to light her candle, and then she started the fire with that candle, Hatav Shil Mutter. So even Eish Mishum Eish, indirect, is also a permission. The turning on the fire is effective. So this machlokas that we just saw between the Beis Yosef and the Darchei Moshe and the Rami Rottenberg, that both of them lived in Europe, was continued by the Shulchan Aruch and Ramah. The Shulchan Aruch forbids the Jew to light the fire. That means lighting the fire is not enough. It's still going to be Bishul Akum, but the Ramah permits it. So that's why if our women Friday morning turn on the oven and then the housekeeper starts cooking, they're relying on this sheet of the Ramah, not the Shulchan Aruch, because we are Ashkenazim, we follow the Ramah. Says the Shulchan Aruch in Yordei Kuf Yud Gimel, Ein Shkiras Hatanur, turning on the oven, Mo'elas Ela B'Pas. That works to take it out of the realm of Pasaku. Aval B'Sharmit Bashlim, but other cooking, Ein Shkiras Hatanur V'Ladlakas Eish Malu Meredes. That doesn't change the status. Ela Ha'anacha Dafka, the Jew has to actually place the dish onto the fire. If you want to cook you want to bring your tray of food to an oven of a non-Jew, the Jew has to place it in there, to the place where the heat is there to allow the cooking process to take place. Says the Rama, he's referring, of course, to the Marami Rottenberg, and he's referring to the Ra'oi that we quoted, and the Aruch. That's the Yesh Chokim. That turning on the fire will work for Bishul the way it works for Pas. And that's our meaning. That means even if you didn't have kavanah when you turned on the fire, that it was going to be done for that cooking. No, you just turned it on. That even if the Jew didn't light the fire, but it's enough that the non-Jew got her original fire from a Jew, then it's all permitted. Shari. So, according to Shulchan Aruch, the Jew must participate in the actual act of cooking, such as placing the food in the oven or on the fire or stirring the food. By contrast, the Ramah allows the Jew to turn on the fire and also cites the opinion that the Gentile lighting a fire from a pre-existing fire lighted by a Jew is sufficient. The more stringent opinion of the Shulchan Aruch is accepted as the standard generally followed by Sephardim, while the more lenient opinion of the Ramah is accepted as the standard followed by Ashkenazim. Most of the kashrus organizations in the Golah rely on the Ramah. Rav Moshe Hyman has a letter in the back of the Seder Shulchan Malachim. regarding this. Rav Ovadia Yosef writes that if the Gentile sets the pot on the stove when the fire has not yet been turned on, and then the Jew turns on the fire, that's also valid. So that's a kula for the Sfardim. So they can, if the non-Jew puts the dish on the oven and it hasn't been turned on, and you as the Jew turn on the fire, then that's enough, even for Sfardim. That's when he said, that's when it's usher. That if the Jew lit the fire and then the goy starts cooking, let's say he put the pot on the oven first, that would be permitted. Says the footnote, a more recent scenario is whether a mashgiach may turn on an oven using a cell phone, remote control, computer, or the like, according to the Ramah. Rav Moshe Heinemann writes that the Star K does not rely on this, though others, such as the Mishnah Halachos, do accept it as valid. I'm not sure what the difference is between somebody turning on a switch at the oven versus turning it on using your cell phone. I mean, I'm not sure I understand the nafkamina. I'd have to read through Rav Heinemann's Tzurba.
But if you're doing it through your cell phone, you could be in a different city. You could be in Paris and turn it on, and you're not watching what they're doing.
It's not a matter of watching, Harold. There's no hashgacha going on here. It has to do with the participation in the cooking process. As long as the Jew turned on the fire, that's enough.
It doesn't even have to be even close to where it is.
You have to turn them, meaning traditionally, when you turned on the oven, you were right there. But it's nothing. That has nothing to do with it.
So if it was on a timer and the Jew set the timer to automatically, it's the same principle.
I don't see a difference between that, or if he touches a button on his iPhone or a remote control and it turns on. What was that?
What if you say, Alexa, turn on the oven? That's good enough too?
Well, Alexa, do it.
It's the same thing. You're the one who's doing it. What's the difference between that action or switching on, turning a knob? What's the difference, halachically?
I don't know. You can think your hand is you're actually doing something with your hands. I don't know.
So you want to say that maybe there's a chisoron in Maisa. Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe. Okay. Maybe that could be the svara. That it's not considered a dibur, it's not a Maisa. So this and maybe, as you say, remotely, electronically. I mean, you still if you trigger a button on your cell phone, that turns it on. I'm not sure why that's not as much of a mice as turning it on.
Well, that might be equivalent to a switch, but like you said, dibur.
Okay, could be. Okay, I get it. They didn't quote why the Star K doesn't rely on it. We'd have to. Okay, my turn. Now, there is a concept called Michael ben Drusoy. Ben Drusoy was a famous highway robber in the times of Chazal. And he was always on the go because he was being chased by the law. So they never ate their food fully cooked. That means it's been determined by Chazal that the measurement of Michael ben Drusoy is 1/3. That means you cook the food to about 1/3. This is an issue regarding preparing certain foods before Shabbos, that in order for, let's say, food to continue cooking into Shabbos, some foods have to be cooked at least to the level of Michael ben Drusoy. That once you get it to a level of 1/3, then you can let it continue cooking on Shabbos. But if it's before the level of Michael ben Drusoy, you can't. So here also, this concept is going to come in by Bishul Akum. What is the halacha? The Gentile cooks the food for the first stage, and the Jew then completes the cooking process. According to the Ramah, if it was only 1/3 cooked, right, Michael ben Drusoy, by the Gentile, it would not be subject to Bishul Akum. But the Shulchan Aruch holds that food is forbidden unless there is significant. Even that food would be forbidden unless there was hefsid meruba, shas atchak, or financial loss. The Shulchan Aruch would permit in that situation, but otherwise he would not permit.
How did the Ramah come up with the shear of Michael ben Drusoy? Is it Gemara?
No, Sydney, the Gemara deals with Michael ben Drusoy. Yes, not by Bishul Akum, by other, like I said, by Shabbos.
But he applied it here.
They applied it here because they wanted to use it as a leniency. As a leniency. Well, we already said, if you just turn, according to Ramah, if you turn on the fire, you don't need to mix it. If you mix it, that's certainly it's better than turning on the fire. Mixing it is even according to Shulchan Aruch. The Sfardim have to mix it. We said the Sfardim, they must mix it. They cannot just rely on turning on the light. So mixing it is much better than turning on the fire. Right? Okay. So if you went and mixed it, it's better than turning it on.
Or you can shut the fire and turn it back on.
You don't have to. As long as you mix it, it's even better than turning on the fire. We saw that very clearly. Because Shulchan Aruch allows that, and even though you didn't turn the fire on. You don't need both turning the fire and mixing. If you mixed it, then you participate in the cooking process. So Sydney, the Ramah brought this in because that concept of Michael ben Drusoy exists by Shabbos, so they used it here as well. Mm-hmm. That if it was only 1/3 cooked, right, it would not be subject to Bishul Akum. Says the Shulchan Aruch, in Bishul Goy, Michael ben Drusoy, the non-Jew cooked it to 1/3. The Gomer Yisrael, Yesh Lesor. Yesh Lesor is a less harsh version of it's Aser. It says Yesh Lesor, we should Aser. He says Ella Imkain hu Erev Shabbos or Erev Yontif. He knows that people spend a lot of money Erev Shabbos, Erev Yontif. If we're not going to say that this food has to be thrown out, that's a hefsid meruba, and it's a shas atchak. You're not going to be able to have food for your family and guests. So in that situation, but if it's a Tuesday, and then he wouldn't want you to use the food. He'd want you to throw it out. Oh, she ate hefsid meruba b'davar. Says the Ramah v'yesh matirim b'chol inyan, right? So that's certainly permitted according to Ashkenaz. Now, contemporary Israeli poskim discuss if it is permitted for a Gentile, this is a wild question, to cut shawarma at a restaurant off of the vertical rotisserie on which it is cooked, since cutting the outer pieces off causes the inner pieces to get cooked more quickly. So they're wondering, maybe you should not allow an Arab worker to cut the pieces off the shawarma, because in a sense, he's being mavashel the inner pieces. According to Rav Asher Weiss and Minchas Osher, it's permitted, even for Sfardim, who follow the opinion of Shulchan Aruch, provided it was a Jew who placed that big piece of meat on this rotisserie initially. Near the kolabos raya nitzla b'meshech hazman, he says anyways the food's going to get cooked. The ain't kind of like kirvas bishul b'grama. What the non-Jew is doing by trimming away some of the outer meat, it's a grama. It's indirect hastening of the cooking. Since the initial placement of the shawarma and turning on the fire was done by the Jew, then he's matir. Now, what about non-Jewish servants or employees in a Jew's house? What are their status? This is dealt with by the poskim, whether Bishul Akum even applies to servants working in a Jew's house. The Rashba, now remember, the Rashba lived in the 1300s. He cites the opinion of the Ramban that is permitted since the concern of intermarriage is not usually relevant with respect to a servant in the house of a Jew who is the master. Nevertheless, the Rashba disagrees. Yesh Baraboisai, he's referring to the Ramban. He wanted to say that our servants, we could eat their food because we're not going to marry them. The whole problem why we're not supposed to eat bishul akum is because of intermarriage. This is a non-Jew who wants to attract a Jew. It's somebody that we're concerned that you might go after them for marriage. But ve'elu osin ben yirtzu ben lo yirtzu. A servant has to do the work, whether they like you, they don't like you, they want, they don't want. Ben kiruv das, because therefore, it's not likely that there's going to be kiruv das. There's going to be meeting of the minds between these two parties. So that was the reason for the Ramban to permit cooking by servants. We call Malcolm, says the Rashba, Ein divrei mechavrin beinenu. He says they're not clear. I don't agree. He says even our servants, we cannot eat their food, even b'di'evet, after the fact. You got to throw it away or sell it. Right? Like the ones above, this case as well is subject to a dispute between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. The Shulchan Aruch presents the lenient opinion and then the stringent opinion. And in such cases, it is usually accepted that the latter opinion, it's stam v'yesh. The first opinion of the Shulchan Aruch is a stam opinion. Then he'll say v'yesh, whatever, yesh osrim or yesh matirim. So there's a rule in Psak Halacha. Stam v'yesh, halacha ki yesh. It doesn't make a difference whether the yesh is more stringent or whether the yesh is more lenient. Here, it so happens that the yesh was the stringent one, and that's the one that's followed as the practical halacha. The Ramah is lenient, even lechatchila, if the cooking actually takes place in the house of the Jew. So the Ramah says if you have servants in your home, cooking in your home, it's not a problem. The bishul akum says Shulchan Aruch yesh mi shematir b'shvachos shalanu. Who is the Shulchan Aruch talking about? The Ramban, who we just quoted. But the yesh mi she'oser afilu b'di'evet. That's the stam v'yesh. Well, here it's actually yesh v'yesh, but it's the last yesh. Says the Ramah, v'di'evet yesh l'smoch adivrei matiri. Ramah says you can rely on the people who say it's permitted. Afilu chatchila noagin la'akim b'beis Yisrael. Shashvachos v'avodim b'vashim b'beis Yisrael. The maids and everything they cook in the Jew's house. One of the Jews in the house is going to get involved by stirring or turning it on or whatever. Now, may this leniency be relied upon today by someone who has non-Jewish help in the home. May he or she cook one's food without concern for bishul akum. The Shach, writing on the Shulchan Aruch, probably in the mid-1600s, early 1700s, I think late 1600s. So again, a lot of this had to do with the laws that were abounding in Poland and in Western Europe at the time. John Locke, right, and the rights of man. There were no servants anymore. Remember, in the times of the Ramban, 1200, 1300, there were indentured servants. There was still, you might have owned your servant in the house. But this begins to change in Western Europe, and the Shach is going to take up on that. The Shach notes that the maidservants in later times may not have had the same status that they did in earlier times, as perhaps the leniency that we just discussed applies only to servants that are legally owned by their master. Today, all workers and helpers are only employees, to which bishul akum may still apply. The Shach then proceeds to offer 4 interpretations of the Ramah's leniency. B'shvachos shalanu, says the Shach, sheknuyos lanu, that is, Shvachu Shalanu he interprets to mean people that are owned by the master. Dimlacha de'eved arel d'Yisrael. The work product of an Eved who is a non-Jew that is owned by Israel belongs to the Jew. Umuzar alav b'Shabbos min haTorah. He has to make sure he doesn't work on Shabbos. The lesser b'chlal nochrin. An Eved who is knuya to the Jew is not considered a non-Jew. Hilkach lesser b'klal gzeres chasnos. And such an Eved would not, there was no concern that you were going to marry him. You couldn't marry him because you couldn't marry an Eved Kanani. Ad kan l'shon shuvas Ramban. Shehevi Beis Yosef Darkei Moshe. Right? This is what the Beis Yosef Ramah brought. However, Hanach Shvachos Mayra Mechaber, the Rav Yosef Karo also lived in the Middle East, where it could be that there were still servants owned. Says the Shach, Avalo b'Shvachos Shalanu sheBa'artzos Eile. But our maids in Europe are not like that. She'ein knuyos lanu. We don't own them. Rak sheniskru l'shana. We hire them out for the year. We don't have to make sure that they keep Shabbos. Vizeh, mashakosov harav bahagah. That which the Ramah wrote, that uvdiyevet yesh lismoch adivrei matirim, that we should be somech on the lenient lo ati shaper b'shvachos shalanu. The Shach right away says it doesn't apply to our shvachos. So what does apply? So he gives the following four gedorim. Tzarch lomar, the koya shvachos tamar mechaber. When the Ramah was lenient, he was talking about the servants at the time of the mechaber that were owned. Or ritzon lomar, the yesh lismoch adivrei matirim b'shulei goyim b'veis Yisrael. Or he wants to say maybe the leniency relates to when the cooking takes place in a Jew's house, where we said before, where there's always going to be somebody around to stir the pot. The Shach refers to the opinion of Rabbeinu Avraham, cited in Tosfos, and the Tur, who permits bishul akum of a servant if the cooking takes place in the home of the Jew, as he holds that this scenario would not engender closeness or intermarriage between the family of the Jew and the Gentile. And according to the Shach, this opinion of Rabbeinu Avraham in Tosfos it may be the source of the leniency of the Ramah. Number 3, inami, harav lo dikdik bezeh. Maybe the Ramah wasn't careful in his wording. The ikar de milsa samech atame de yefshar shelo yichteh echad b'abayis ma'ad. And he wanted to be sure that if it was done in the Jew's house, somebody would stir the pot a little bit. Number 4, ayin behis isra ve'heter shel marshal. Maybe Shuvas Rajba, who quotes the Ramban, the Yesh Rabbi said Matir Bishvachos, Mitam de Inisra Mishum Bishulei Goyim El Bo'isum Mertzon Mishum Gzeres Chasnos. The whole reason that they answered all of this was because of marriage. Aval Elu Ashvachos Vavodim Shalanu She'osim Ba'al Korcham. The servants that do it against their will, right? Because they're hired as servants. They're owned by the master. Ben Yirtzu, Ben Loyed, whether they want to, not want to. So then, Ein Bezen Kira Das B'Kol Mokum Ein Divrei Chaber Beinenu. That's why the Rashba rejected it. Ve'Nav Somch Malzel Ufi Zeh Yesh Lomar. This first Hamati Shekosov Mechaber Umitam Zeh Lezeh Kosov Arav Diyesh Lismoch Aleim B'Di'eved El Beis Yosef Darkei Moshe Lo Niskar Tam Zeh. So, based on what we have seen, it seems that the Shulchan Aruch holds that there's no leniency for maidservants, while according to the Ramah, it's possible that it may be permitted when cooking the Jew's home. According to the Shach, it may depend upon which of his four interpretations of the Ramah are followed. The Shach's first explanation that the Ramah refers only to bought servants would seem to prohibit hired employees. The second explanation, that you can be lenient within the house of a Jew, might permit hired help in one's house because you're going to help cooking it. The third explanation, that in the Jew's house, the Jew presumably would also help with the cooking, but only if this consideration is applicable. And the fourth explanation might permit it based on the logic of the Ramban, that even hired workers must comply with the instructions of the owner, so perhaps closeness will not be created. That means even if our maids are employees, nobody's getting married to them. They're on a different class and a different status. So the practical halacha says that Tzurba Rabbanan, though, is that we do not allow bishul akum of hired helper maids even in one's home in most standard cases lechatchila, since all of the leniencies are questionable. B'di'evet, though it may be allowed in some cases, as described by Rabbi Cohen. So we, our housekeepers, we do have to resort to the various tricks that we've learned in tonight's shiur, turning on the fire, turning the stove, mixing the stove, etc. We can't just throw out the fact that it's not bishul akum because of the shach. If you have two things going for you, they're hired maids. The cooking is in Jew's house. He says only b'di'evet would you be makel. You can eat it, and you don't have to kasher the kelim b'di'evet. But lechatchila you couldn't do it. Can Sfardim rely on the leniencies of the Ramah? Well, that is because we see the Ramah allows you to turn on the fire. Rav Ovadia Yosef utilizes this dispute to attempt to explain a different issue. He notes that since Sfardim generally follow the halal, the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch, they should not be allowed to eat the types of food subject to bishul akum, where a Jew only lights the fire but does not participate in the actual cooking. Because remember, for Sfardim, turning on the fire is not enough. And therefore, what Rav Ovadia Yosef is thinking, well, maybe Sfardim can only eat like carrots, because carrots is no bishul akum by carrots because it's cooked raw. But something that's not eaten raw, maybe a Sfardi shouldn't eat that. The problem is that in many restaurants and hotels in Israel that are under standard Rabbanut certification, as well as in the diaspora, only the standards of the Ramah are followed for bishul akum. How then can Sfardim eat at such places? Rav Ovadia attempts to defend their custom by employing a sfeik sfeika, a double doubt. That's very important because safek, now normally safek deraisa is l'chumra, safek derabanan is l'kula, but even so, we might aser l'chatchila to do something. But when you have a double doubt, when you have a sfeik sfeika, two sfeikos, and the law is only rabbinic, it's usually permitted. So by employing a sfeik sfeika, using the issue of the servants, since it is uncertain whether we accept the opinions that allow Gentile servants to cook the food, that means even today's workers. Remember, we brought some opinions that even today's workers are considered like you own them, and therefore there wouldn't be a problem with chasnus. That's one suffix. And it's uncertain whether we follow Shulchan Aruch or Ramah for whether the Jew must participate in the actual cooking. We may be lenient due to this double uncertainty. Although regarding both points, the Shulchan Aruch is machmir, right? Rav Ovadia suggests that perhaps Rav Yosef Kar himself would have been lenient in cases where both points are relevant together due to the sfeik sfeika. She'ela. This was a question asked to Rav Ovadia. Batei malon umisadot, hotels and restaurants. Shebahem yesh mashgiach ala kashrut mitam rabbanut harashit hamekomit. The mashgiach there has been appointed by the Rav Rashi, the Rabbanut in Israel. The yesh lahem tuda kashrut. And there's a tuda there. Berama tabach shemavashel es atavshilim imkomos elu hu aravi. He says most of the cooks are Arab. Ela shasakata eish shalatanu arbishul vafia nasis l'idei Israel. But the Rabbanut relies on the heter of the Ramah that the Jew turns on the fire. Shua mashgiach la kashrut, the mashgiach does it. Ha'imutar lechol mitbashlim elu l'lo chashash isra bishulei goy. I guess he was asked by his Sephardic community, can we eat there? Tshuva nimtza shadavar shanoi b'machlokas haposkim. Now we can understand this complicated Ovadia Yosef tshuva because we've been through the sources ourselves. V'yoshanu asfardim ve'edot hamizrach kibanu aleinu harat maran hashulchan aruch. Since we normally accept the Shulchan Aruch only, ein lanu lahakel b'zeh, we shouldn't be lenient. Kevan shadat maran le'asar b'di'evet. The Shulchan Aruch said that even after the fact, you cannot eat this food. The Chidor was Rabbi Azulai, who lived in Eretz Yisrael in the 1700s, was a Sfaradi. Sfaradi shemekel kedas Ramah, that a Sfardi who is lenient like the Ramah, benigud la Ras Moran, chayev lasot tshuva kapara. He has to do tshuva. So the Rav Ovadia Yosef is formulating the shayla. But he says we can find merit in those Sfardim that rely on this heter. The non-Jews who work in the hotels or restaurants are employees. We brought some of the Rishonim that said that even a hired worker is treated as if he's owned by us. And therefore we wouldn't marry them because they do it whether we want. They do it whether they want to or not want to. They're forced to do it, so it's not going to come to chasmus. That's what we explained before. In our case, we can be making because now he's adding b'tziruf. Hatama rishon shisrael madlik aseir. You also have this issue that the Jew is lighting the fire. V'im ken yeshanu sfeik sfeik lahatir. Shema halacha kapos k'masar v'shgav v'mishuli goy mitiru be'asek ha'yidei Yisrael. Right? Even though the Sfardim follow of Yosef Karo, it's still a suffix. Who is the halacha like? Is it like Rav Yosef Karo is like the Ramah? Even though they follow the Rav Yosef Karo, could be that the halacha is like the Ramah. The Lorak B'Pas Goyim. Not just the leniency of turning on the fire for baking bread, but even for cooking. And if you're going to hold only like those who argue with that, but maybe we have this leniency that hired workers are treated like servants. Even though both of those suffixes are against the Shulchan Aruch, you can rely on it. Another Sephardi posting. Rav Ovadia wanted a precedence to his side, and he brought an example by this other Sephardi posting that even when the Sfeikos, creating the Sfeikos, both are against the Shulchan Aruch, yesh lahakel b'sfeik sfeika. Ki after shagam Moran yodish to b'tzarf l'shteim yachdav yesh latir. Maybe Rav Yosef Karo himself, with these two Sfeikos, would be matir, ayin sham. Ume'ata davar pashut, shagam b'nidon shalanu yesh makom nirchav l'smoch lakel gam l'sfardim u'bnei dota mizrach. He says, therefore, there's a reason to be lenient by Sfardim. Ken kosu b'shut minchas Yitzchak. Remember, the Minchas Yitzchak was Dayan Weiss in the Eda Charedis, an Ashkenazi. So he passed in the same way. However, b'sikum, this is still Ovadia. They could be invited as guests to a Jew's home or to a hotel. Even though the cook is non-Jew. The Mashgiach has lit the oven. If the fire went out, the Jew has to relight it. However, so it's a beautiful, difficult. It's a Shaila Tshuva that we went through now tonight. That without having learned all the Makorot that we did tonight, we really wouldn't have been able to go through this Shaila Tshuva. Now, Rav Ben Zion Aber Shol adamantly forbids Sephardim from being lenient in this case, since in his opinion, Sephardim may not employ a sfeik that contradicts the ruling of Ovadia Yosef Karo. We see here a Melchamta Shel Torah, right? There's a real battle royal going on here between these poskim. We can't eat in a restaurant, you're talking about Sfardim, where the cook is a non-Jew. And only the Yehudim Madlikim et ha'esh bilvad, and the only way that they're getting around Bishalakum is by lighting the fire. Because the Sfardim don't agree with that. and it's the goyim that are cooking. He says, the law means sfeik sfeika neged maran. We don't say sfeik sfeika if both of the opinions and the suffix were against the Shulchan Aruch. He also knows about Rav Rama Kohen Soloniki. Even neged maran, gam ken ein latir kan. He says we shouldn't be matir here. Mishum shenir shekan maran lo sosa mechli la'achmir, el apostle came betowards vaday. The Shulchan Aruch didn't just rule stringently; he ruled it betowards vaday. Shemai zerak sofek, harei kan avi usud rabbanon. If there's going to be a sofek, I mean, what's the problem? The whole issue of bishul akum is only rabbanon. The sofek rabban lakula. Al korcha shekan maran pasuk betowards vaday. It wasn't a sofek case; otherwise he would have been lenient. The sofek rabbanon, so he was vaday for sure that he knew what the halacha was. Vim king and lalasas possess fake. Okay, so the Sfard, it's not a problem for us. But the Sfardim can rely on Rav Ovadia Yosef if they follow him. He says that Rav Binyamin Bar Shalom, in another Sefer Shulchan Malachim, claims that Rav Ovadia more recently publicly agreed that ideally Sfardim should not be lenient about this matter, and his response was written many years earlier at a time when it had been difficult to be stringent. On the other hand, Rav Eliezer Melamed suggests a slightly different explanation for how Sfardim may be lenient. Since the entire institution of Bishul Akum is rabbinic, we may follow the principle of Sofek Rabban Lakula and accept the opinion of the Ramah. So he recommends that Sfardim be stringent, lechatchila, but the Evet to rely on. Now, what about cooking processes without fire, like smoking or salting? Even if we are generally stringent concerning non-Jewish helpers, that all of the restrictions of Bishul Akum apply, one can still question whether there is room to be lenient to cook food in the microwave. Is cooking in a microwave defined as halachic cooking with respect to the rules of Bishul Akum? Perhaps the answer has been derived from rulings of the Shulchan Aruch Ramah concerning salting, smoking, and soaking done by a Gentile, where they state that those methods of preparing food, which are considered equivalent to cooking halachically within the laws of kashrus, are still not subject to Bishul Akum, which only applies to cooking by fire. Says the Shulchan Aruch, dag shemolchu ovi kochavim, a fish that was smoked by a non-Jew, uperos she'oshtan ad shekshin lachila. I guess they used to smoke fruit. Hare elu mutarim, de maluach ena krotech b'gzerzu. That when we say salting, when we have basar b'chalav and we salt milk and cheese together, there's absorption. Or if you have a non-kosher piece of meat next to a non-kosher piece of meat, and we salt them together. So salting does create transfer of flavor. So does soaking something in brine for 24 hours. We learned that in a previous year. But that's only for Isra V'Heter. Regarding this Gzeir Bishul Akum, it's a different Gzeira. And it's not considered Bishul Akum. Smoking is not like cooking. Says Ramav Gam Kavush, which is brining, when the takana of Bishul Akum came down, it was only through fire. Although one could argue from here that Bishul Akum should only apply to fire and not to cooking in a microwave, we could argue because it's similar to smoking. Rav Vosner, the Shevet HaLevi, writes that anything that is considered a normal manner of cooking would be included in the restriction. And therefore, cooking in a microwave, which is very common today, would be subject to Bishul Akum. The two reasons, either through marriage, either because you're going to come to marry them, or because they're going to put something non-kosher, because they're shaykh the mikrogel. They both apply to microwave. If this is the way that you cooked the food initially in a microwave, but others, such as Rav Osher Weiss, claim that the matter is not so simple. And he permits a Gentile helper to cook for an elderly person who is ill in cases of need, in conjunction with the opinion that any workers are not subject to Bishul Akum. Rav Heinemann also rules that Bishul Akum does not apply to cooking in a microwave. And there's also issue of whether steaming, which is the way that many factory plants prepare food, is different than cooking by fire and should not be included. Rav Avadia Yosef, the Minchas Yitzchak, said that steaming is also not a problem and there's no Bishul Akum. Rav Moshe, as noted by Rav Nota Greenblatt, as ruling leniently for any type of cooking performed specifically in the context of a factory, in cases where it could be possibly done, could not possibly be done in one's private home, because the concern for closeness in the marriage is not applicable, where the consumer could never meet the Gentile performing the cooking in the factory. And that includes many types of steaming. So we can see there are many solid poskim that we rely on all the time that are lenient. Other poskim, such as Rav Vosner, Sheikh Levi, Rav Yashiv, rule stringently, and kashrut organizations take differing approach to this issue. The policy of the OU is to be lenient, using the combination of both reasons together, but steaming in one's home would not be permitted. That means if you steam in a factory, you use the concept that steaming is not cooking and the concept that you're never going to meet the non-Jew in a factory to marry them. But but steaming in your home would be considered cooking. So let's see how Minchas Osher is lenient. Bizmanenu en bishul b'microwave ikar derech bishul. So he says, first of all, do people actually cook spaghetti in their microwave? They warm it up. I mean, do they cook a turkey in the microwave? In general, you don't cook your food in a microwave. What's an example where you cook your food? Pizza comes, you heat it up. You don't cook the pizza in the microwave. You bake it in an oven, then you heat it up.
The microwave
Yeah,
has
I was going to
settings.
say a microwave is mostly used to heating up food.
That's what I'm
in
saying.
general.
You don't cook.
You don't
cook
actually
the food.
cook.
You don't cook lechatchila. So
I
he's
mean,
saying,
we actually, we put a stock of corn, and we basically cook it up in the microwave.
that's a problem. That would be a
Yeah.
problem if you're
That's the
cooking
only
it.
thing I can think that we actually cook in the microwave.
There are
so
books called microwave cooking. So, and there are microwave ovens that have settings for cooking. The
I'm
Jews
saying- but
don't
I'm
know how to
saying-
use those things. That's all.
So I'm saying in our general usage, I don't think most of our cookings go on
Our
in the microwave,
cookings.
although it can be done.
Right, our cooking stands.
So bizmanenu en bishul b'microwave ikar derech bishul. Vein echuto ke'echut bushul eish. Rav Osher said the quality of the food that comes out is not as good as when you cook it on fire. Umasha Kosev Shevet HaLevi sheyesh chasdus. He says that was Shevet HaLevi said that there's worry about marriage. Tmeini mi yomar shema'ushan lo shaychi chashashut elu vaval pi chen lo gozru.
Right. That's also a method of cooking.
Rav Asher points out that Chazal do not impose residual bishul in the case of smoked foods,
Right.
regardless of the fact that concern for intermarriage could still apply there. So too, it should not apply to food cooked in a microwave, says Rav Asher.
Mm-hmm.
Yesh lismoch b'shas adchak shegoya tivashal b'microwave b'tzirif das ramo shebemishareses noagu lahakel u'beprat shemeduber b'chola. He says that if, let's say, a caregiver is taking care, a non-Jewish caregiver is taking care of an elderly person, you can rely on the Gentile cooking in a microwave because it's not a normal way of bishul, right? So it's in a sense a leniency. In any case, we should note that according to many poskim, reheating food that is already cooked is not included bishul akum, as nobody says for zakash. Therefore, since most use of a microwave today is for reheating food rather than cooking raw foods, the use of a microwave by a Gentile will often be permitted according to all opinions, right? Says the Sefer HaKadosh, Michael Shekvan Yisfashal Al Yidei Yisrael. Afilo nitin loch lokashu kar. Now, even though you normally don't eat it cold, you got to eat it hot. Ein b'chim la'yidei goy yisur b'shul goy. But heating it up is not a problem. Now, final subject today. If bishul akum is carried out in someone's home, do the utensils require kashering? We know that in general, a kosher utensil was used for cooking non-kosher food or for cooking basar b'chala must be kosher. Does the same halacha apply to utensil used for cooking by Gentiles? In other words, is bishul akum equivalent to cooking non-kosher food or basar b'chala? The Torah cites a machlokas rishonim concerning this point. The Rashba holds that utensils must be kosher, while the Rush holds that they are permitted to be used without koshering. Says the Torah, Yordea Siman Kufiyat Gimel, that's the Siman of bishul akum. Because of Rashba, v'chein kelim shebishul ben odi glilim, dvorim sheish ben mishum bishulei odi glilim asurin. The Rashba says the kelim are asur. We have to be careful. Let's say a maid wants to cook for himself food, and they use the pot, the Veis Rabban Yisrael shlo yanichu al gabi haor. You can't let her by herself there. And if you put it there first, you got to stir it until it's at least 1/3 cooked. And remember, the Tur was Rav Yaakov ben Arosh. So he doesn't understand his father, Zal, because of She'ein Tzarech Lachush L'Zaklal. Shlachmir B'Shlei of the Gelun Lesser Pleitaso. He says that when they made the Gzeira of Bishul Akum, they didn't make the Gzeira on the flavors. What asers are pots? Remember, the blia, the flavor of the non-kosher food, or the basar b'chala gets absorbed by the walls of the pot. So that's a blia. Now remember, we learned tam ki ikr. Flavor is like the ikr. So that's why we have a problem with the basar b'chala or dvarim isser. But who said the Rosh, that the gzeira of bishul akum created an isser so much so that even the blia would be asur. So according to Rajma, food subject to bishul akum are treated no differently than foods that are non-kosher, and they will render the utensils that are cooked treif. According to the Rosh, Chazal were not stringent to treat food subject to bishul akum as transferring taste, presumably because there's nothing intrinsically forbidden about the food. It's not an isser chefza, right? There's an isser gavra, isser chefza. So, for example, we don't eat on Yom Kippur. That's an isser gavra. We can't eat. It's not that the food is asur. But then there's isser chefza. Nevela is intrinsically asur. A piece of treif meat is an isser chefza. So basically, the Rosh is claiming that bishul akum is in a sense like an isser gavra. We can't eat it, but it's not that it created an intrinsically asur food. And therefore, he says the utensils don't have to be kosher, says the Rosh. So the Shulchan Aruch cites both opinions, this time in the form of an anonymous opinion of being stringent, and a yesh omrim that is lenient. He adds, though, that even according to the first opinion of being stringent, earthenware utensils, which we know absorb too much and normally can't be koshered, may be koshered in this case of bishul akum by performing agola with boiling water 3 times. Says the Shulchan Aruch, kelim shebishul b'hem agoy lefanenu, dvorim sheish b'hem mishum bishul egoyim tzrichim hechsher. That's the stam opinion. V'yesh, right? So here's an example of stam. It's unnamed. He doesn't say who. That's called stam v'yesh. V'yesh shamim she'enem tzrichim. Remember, we learned earlier tonight in the Shulchan Aruch, whenever we have a stam v'yesh, we usually paskin like the v'yesh. He says, even according to Machmirim, if it's earthenware, magilo shlosh pamim v'dyao, you could pour boiling water in it 3 times. Because the Isra doesn't arrive from Daraisa. So since the Shulchan Aruch appears to present the stringent opinion as the more primary one, the practical law is that the utensils must be kosher. However, if they were used prior to that for cooking, the food may in many cases nevertheless be permitted, as stated by the Shach. And there is majority in the tafshil against the pot. Shari to be surely going b'telim berov. Here you don't need shishim, you just need rov. So there could be rov. So it says apparently the halacha lechatchila is to be stringent and to require hechsher. I don't see a lenient opinion of the Ramah. Okay, so next week, we finish Bishul Akum. Next week, Mitzvah Hashem, we'll learn about Pas Akum, Cholav Akum, and Gvinas Akum.
It's amazing.
Now, tomorrow, can everybody learn at 5 o'clock?